As you might recall if you've been following this series, our Blood Bowl Necromantic horror team is starting to progress along quite nicely now, and we've made some serious headway into getting it done. There have been 2 previous videos, and if you're watching this one, I do recommend that either before or after you go and check out those 2 as well, because some of the techniques that we're going to use are explained in the previous videos and won't be in this one. For today though, we're going to be focusing on 2 of the really cool, slightly unique sculpts in the Necromantic horror box, and that's the 2 werewolves and the 2 ghosts. For the werewolves, I want to take 2 different approaches to show you 2 different ways that you can tackle the fur on them, and everything else will be covered in those previous videos. Again, kind of making them essential watching for this one. When it comes to the ghosts, I'm going to have a bit of fun though. I want to use some paints that you've probably got, but in a way that you maybe don't use them. Now I will warn that this does include using an airbrush, and that's not going to be for everybody, but it is going to just give you a little idea of how you can maybe take some of those paints on your shelf that you normally use only for very specific things and try them out in other areas. So let's get on with painting some more undead. Okay, step 1, werewolf number 1, we're going to be working up through these 3 colours, heather blue, icy yellow, and whatever kind of white you're in the mood for really. So let's get on with that first of all. And so to kick off proceedings, we'll just get a nice even coat of heather blue all over the fur. This heather blue is a really great coverage paint. You probably won't struggle to get it covered nice and flat in about 2 coats. So now here's where I'm going to start introducing the mixes of ice yellow into that heather blue, and I think the easiest way to describe the process of what I'm doing here is kind of manually painting a zenithal. So towards the upward facing parts of the miniature, I'm getting brighter and brighter by mixing more and more of the ice yellow into the heather blue. But I'm painting it by hand, not with an airbrush. And by gradually adding more and more and more of that ice yellow in, we get a nice sort of top-down highlighted effect to our fur, which looks, in my opinion at least, really, really cool. You'll notice that as I'm getting lighter, I'm starting to use far more controlled textural strokes. So I'm being deliberate, I'm choosing where I'm placing the stroke here, but it is kind of there for texture, not blending. So we want the stroke to stand out, we don't want it to just fade into the colour underneath it. It's also worth noting that I don't actually introduce the white until right near the end of the workup, so it's almost completely worked up by the time we involve any white whatsoever. It's just heather blue and ice yellow up to that point. And same goes for shade, it doesn't come in until right at the end. What I actually want to do is completely work this up a bit too bright, and then I'm grabbing Nuln Oil here and actually using that to pull everything back down again. And that's the end result, some nice quick and simple sort of blue-grey fur for our first wolf. You might be asking yourself why I went with a bluey colour. Well, I was born in the mid-80s, which means that the 90s is kind of my formative gaming era, which means that I'm a huge fan of Altered Beast, which was a pack-in game with the Sega Mega Drive here in the UK. And I was just thinking of Altered Beast, so I've got a blue wolf and a brown wolf. Let's paint the brown one now. We're going to be using the dry brush method this time round, so these are the paints that I've got here. You can see that I'm only going up as bright as a Xandri dust here, which is, if you're going to be doing a dry brush where you don't need to use a shade, you can just start with a really dark brown. I think this is a good idea to remember that you don't need to push the contrast too far up towards white or bone colours, because you might get a bit of a washed out look if you do that. So for our first base coat, it's just going to be some Nihilakh Oxide, and you'll notice I'm really slapping it on here, being super messy. And that's just because with this being a dry brush method, we have no choice but to be messy, really. That's kind of the technique. So we're going to have to clean up later anyway. If we're going to have to clean up later anyway, there's no point in standing on ceremony. Just get it on there. And now I'll just start dry brushing up through those colours shown, Mournfang Brown, XV88, up into Xandri Dust, just working up progressively, being sort of more towards tips and top facing surfaces and stuff like that as we start to get brighter and just get a nice built up gradient with that dry brush. And when I go through XV88 and get into Xandri, that's when I'll also switch down just to a smaller dry brush, just so that we can kind of attack those finer, smaller areas without risking maybe dry brushing highlight into an area that should be shadowed. And then I can quickly take care of that tidying up I spoke about. This will just take a few seconds whipping around the model, and I'm basically just blacking out areas again because I always like to work from a black base coat anyway. Okay, and now that we're at this stage, we're now going to be going back and filling in all the things that were shown previously in the other 2 videos. So once again, I've already suggested them once, but I will pop them up in the top again so that you can click them again easily. Okay, so now I want to do the same thing with the ghosts, just show you how to get them to a point that isn't covered in the previous videos, and then we can use the techniques from those videos to finish them off. So I'm going to be using some technical and contrast paints here, as I said earlier, but I'm going to be putting them through the airbrush, which isn't a use you'd normally go with. In this case, we're going with Nihilakh Oxide and Leviathan Blue contrast paint, which are both really, really cool colours. They've got a lot of saturation to them. They look really bright and funky and interesting. But we normally kind of just use them for a single purpose, and I think it's cool to play with our paints and find other things that we can do with them. So from a white undercoat, we're going to start with that Nihilakh Oxide, and we're spraying basically at 90 degrees to the miniature here, flat onto the front of the miniature. We're just trying to really miss the very top so that we get this little white cap on kind of each hand and the head area. But for the main body of the miniature, we pretty much want everything to be hit with Nihilakh Oxide. Now, one of the cool things about this is because we're doing it with an airbrush, it will actually kind of naturally fall into some of the shadow areas, and it'll have this really cool effect of sort of self-shading. So we're not going to need to go back in afterwards and apply a shade, although you absolutely could if you wanted to, and if you did, I'd probably recommend something like Drakenhof Nightshade just thinned down. Okay, and then we just need to target the lower areas of the sort of drapey parts with that Leviathan Blue. Again, this goes great through the airbrush, and it's a really cool way to experiment with it if you do happen to own an airbrush. You can just sort of pick out these bottom areas, and it really likes to just naturally blend into colours like Nihilakh Oxide for some reason. So you get this very cool kind of ombre blended effect that I personally really like. And that is actually everything that we have to go over in this video. How simple was that? Everything else is detailed previously. Part 1 is going to contain a lot of the fundamentals for the uniform and stuff like that. Part 2 is going to have some things like flesh tones in it. And I think, if memory serves correctly, I may have showed the basing scheme in video 2 as well. But I could absolutely be lying about that. Anyway, enough of that. I got them finished off. I got them up to date to the point where we'd used all the techniques from the previous videos. So let's have a look at how they look with the rest of the team. It is so cool to see this Necromantic horror team starting to shape up and come together now. We are just 2 minis and a few tokens from being completely done with them, and this has been a really fun commission for me, just spreading it out over a few weeks and enjoying just watching it progress and build up. All I've got to do now is these 2 constructs, and constructs, they're kind of Frankenstein's monsters, but I think GW calls them constructs. But these are probably the coolest 2 in the box, which is sort of why I saved them for last. So I'm very excited to get this team finished now, and can't wait. And there you have it, nice and simple, nice and straightforward, as we always like to do around here. So if you liked the video, please do give it a thumbs up to let me know that you liked it. You can of course also subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date on what I'm up to here on YouTube. In the description of the video, you'll find links to my social media, as well as a Patreon campaign if you wish to support the stream, with Patreon tiers starting from just 70p a month. So with all that said, I'm going to get out of here, but thank you so much for watching, folks, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.